Thank all of you for coming out today. I'd like to share this story, basically, of my father's experience during World War II. I'm not here as an expert on the 8th Air Force or the course of the war or any of that. I would like to make it clear my primary purpose here is to relate the personal experience or kind of a family story. Now, I know there would be 100 stories, and my father was the bombardier and front gunner in a B-17, and he flew 13 missions successfully over Germany after having been trained at Carlsbad Air Force Base in New Mexico. He did fly 13 successful missions, and then on the 14th mission, flew into the wrong flak field in that sense. And I am no longer clear what happened. It was either that the engine was struck by flak and burst into flame, or the whole wing went off. I'm not sure which. But he did report that the aircraft was spinning, and he had a hard time getting out of it. So a little bit, I have three main ideas here today. One of them is to relate the story of the escape from the aircraft, because I think that may ring a bell with a lot of you, and for me, it's a family story. I've done what I can to figure it out. It looks to me like he opened his parachute about 60 to 200 feet above the ground and survived the fall. That's the short version of it. Now, when he was captured, he was sent to Stalaag Luft III, which was in Sagan, Poland or Czechoslovakia. I've got maps of this. And that's the camp from which The Great Escape. You may be familiar with this movie, The Great Escape. And since that's the greatest touching stone for a lot of you with the camp, the Stalaag Luft III, I'll spend a little bit of time maybe on that. But my primary purpose, because my father was in that camp, I did come into possession of some unusual materials. There were guys in the camp, Bob Neary, who drew drawings of the camp all through and hid it under his jacket. And then he also kept track of everybody's personal experiences. And then after the war, he put this out in a little book. I don't really know how my father got it. He may have known Mr. Neary, and he may have walked right next to him. I'm not sure how the book came into my father's possession, but I know that only 100 copies were made, right in the aftermath of the war. And so this is a very rare book, and these drawings, I thought that the best opportunity to share something unique with you would be to show you these drawings and give you another view of The Great Escape. Because my father actually got to that camp after The Great Escape had already taken place, I'll tell you that. He was there about 3 or 4 months after the tunnels had all been dug, and they did, launch, I think, about 125 men across Germany with fake uniforms and fake IDs, and really created a lot of disruption. And then for those of you that know the full story of The Great Escape, they had the 3 tunnels, Tom, Dick, and Harry, and they did succeed in getting out, and everybody had various adventures. They were captured. It was a very big deal, and then as a result of that, the Germans shot 50 of them in the aftermath. And then after the war was over in Nuremberg, the Germans who did that were tracked down. That again is not my particular story, because the whole thing was over by the time. When my father got to the camp, they had pretty much just posted the news of what had happened. And my father was never directly involved with escape attempts either. It was an unusual fact of how he was billeted, that he was billeted with the English. It was a very crowded camp at the time he came in, and you squeezed in where you could squeeze in. And he was billeted with the English, who tended to have been shot down earlier in the war, tended to have been in the camp a longer time, and tended to know a lot more about how to get their hands on radios and how to deal with this and how to deal with that. So that would be my general plan then. I'd like to get over the basics of the training and the experience jumping out of the airplane fairly quickly so that I can begin showing you these unique drawings. And the Stalaag Luft III, just to summarize quickly, how did that come about? It looked like the Germans had, early in the war, had a variety of camps. And then Americans did start escaping all of the time, and they had other problems with the camps. And Stalaag Luft III was supposed to have been built as the escape-proof camp where they would put all the bad eggs. And then they put all of the new eggs in there as well. People that had just been shot down. And people were getting shot down all the time. And, you know, that was an issue on the ground, was how do we capture these guys and what happens to them. This is Lieutenant John R. or Jack McDonald, my father. You can see he's at a very young age, and I didn't really track that down. I think he must have been about 20. He was 17 when the war began, and this is him with my mother. Now, like a lot of the instances, I think, they got married right between, let's see, he went off to training in Carlsbad, from what I can reconstruct, and then was in training for about 6 months, and then I think he got leave before he was going to go overseas, and I think they got married during this leave, like a lot of people with this sort of last minute, oh, what's happening in the world. So they're from Creston, Iowa, was how they knew each other. They were both in the same high school in Creston, Iowa. Now I'm already jumping into his training event at Carlsbad. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I actually have 2 books. I pulled this one up because it portrays, you know, the kind of a unique situation in the B-17 as far as bailout procedures. You know what I mean? The person who had, I think the roughest time was the front gunner and navigator. Being in the front of that aircraft, you couldn't have your chute on. You had to crawl through a relatively narrow space and then put the chute on. And that's what they're portraying with that trap door, this way out. He had a harder time getting out of the thing, especially, you can imagine, if those G-forces are allowed to build as the craft is going down. In other words, you better move quickly because the G-forces will move. Will build. And from the training deal, these guys had been looking through their scopes so long they got black eyes. And then kind of a graduating thing here, C stands for Chow. And I was able to find out that my father, they seem to have given each other a lot of nicknames. My father seemed to have been known both as Red Dog, Mac, and Raunchy. Naturally, that filled me with joy when I saw that. I couldn't figure why they did that. And here we're starting to get down home. This picture was taken at Carlsbad, and obviously a friend had come out there and dropped him off, and he said, I'll show off my equipment they gave me. And this is one of the pictures of him with his parachute equipment. And then this is, I'm almost sure that this is his actual flight crew and that this is once he gets to England. I haven't been able to trace down what bomb group he was in or track down any of the specifics of where he was stationed. I believe these are the people that he actually flew with, though. This was the war issue, but obviously as it went forward and you were in different groups, the uniforms or the equipment was always changing. But that is a similar parachute to what my father is displaying here. And this is kind of an ironic photo in the sense that he's like this, because this is exactly what he was looking like when he was falling. I believe it would have been from an altitude of about 20,000 feet. And you can see he's got little goggles to protect his eyes. He's got an oxygen mask to keep on. And he's got some pretty good shearling and heavy clothing on, which will help as far as injuries upon landing. They also needed that, of course, because the airplane wasn't heated. So here he is in a utility cap. Now, with this is the telegram you don't want to receive. And that was in the book that I was given here. Secretary of War, deep regret, your husband, Second Lieutenant John R. McDonald, has been reported missing in action since 7 October. Now that would be the date that the airplane was shot down and didn't come back. I assumed they would automatically notify all the family members that were on that airplane. All right, bailing out. I believe what happened was that the aircraft was hit. The pilot ordered everybody to bail out. The aircraft was spinning. My father did not have his parachute on. He jumps back as best he can and makes his way back to where he can put the parachute on, which I think is kind of clipping it on. And then he jumps. And you can go over to that B-17 and see exactly the dilemma that we're talking about. Well, when you come out of that thing, I guess it's okay. Didn't get hit by the tail or anything else, even though the aircraft was spinning. And so he falls out, and now he's involved in a free fall, but he was the last one out. He was the last one out. What does that mean? That means everybody else had already opened their parachutes. And again, I've never heard a report like this. This is just a family story. But my father says that they were shooting at the parachutists who had already opened. Okay, so here's where you got to be really smart, you know, and use your Irish heritage and your real thought process, okay? I won't open my chute. They're shooting the guys with the chute open. I won't open my chute. I won't open my chute. Okay, well that put him in a unique position, didn't it? Because this chute was designed to be opened right away. It's a great big save your life canopy that's huge, and it's meant to be opened in a few minutes. If you don't do that, you start falling faster and faster according to the laws of gravity and physics, which will put you at terminal velocity. Maybe two meanings to that word, meaning both as fast as you can go, and if you hit the ground at that speed, it will be terminal. From what I can tell, that's about 125 miles an hour. I've talked to people that know about parachuting and going, what would happen if you opened a chute at that size when you were going that speed? What happened was my father, he actually reported that he kind of had fun. I guess he knew gymnastics and he was having fun doing somersaults, but then he fell into a cloud and became completely disoriented. He didn't know up from down. And when they do modern high altitude, low opening, okay, they have a great big display of what your altitude is. It's very hard to miss it. But if you're inside a cloud and you're disoriented, you have no idea anymore what's happening. So he became completely disoriented. He fell out of the bottom of the cloud and boom, there's the ground coming up. He saw trees jumping at him. He pulled the ripcord as quickly as he could, and then the family story was always told the same way. He got faster than that. He got hit as hard as he had ever been hit twice, right in a row. And so as we reconstruct that, what must have happened was the initial shock that he received, and it knocked him unconscious. But the initial shock must have been from opening that giant parachute going at that speed. That would have been a big deal because that would have taken the guy and really pulled him up. On the other hand, look, that shock is going to hit him right where it's supposed to, right on the straps that were designed for it, and kind of a whole body deal, but then hit the ground. So that's where I'm coming up with 60 feet above the ground, maybe 120 feet above the ground. Whatever it was a very last minute deal because the two shocks were almost simultaneous. Family story, it's knocked unconscious, no broken bones. And he wakes up in a field, laying on his back and seeing the blue sky. The way he told the story, I don't know, he would elaborate, but he said he thought he was in heaven until a fighter plane crossed the expanse of heaven and he realized he was on earth. He got to his feet and he said he started walking across the field, that he was in a farmer's field, and that what he couldn't figure out was normal fences go around the field, and what is a fence post doing in the middle of the field. And so he's checking out this fence post and stuff like that. And this is, you know, obviously he's dazed. And when he gets it in focus, it's a farmer with a pitchfork, you know, who disarms him. He's taken to a, by the way, this is the A plan too. You talk about 1 in a million opening that thing right at the last moment. Here's another good one. If you're going to get captured, don't get captured by the Gestapo or the Hitler Youth. Get captured by a farmer with a pitchfork. He'll take you to the local jail. And he did get kind of paraded through the village and spat upon, but they put him safely in the jail, and he spent the night. And the next morning a truck arrived to take him to Stalaag Luft III. And he tells that there were dead bodies in the truck, as well as some guys that were prisoners and were being taken in. And they take him to the camp for Stalaag Luft III. I don't know how long the drive was. He did face interrogation. It was straightforward. He said the interrogator not only spoke better English than he did, but knew much, much more about the operation of the airbase than he did. And as soon as they both realized that, it was over. The only incident was over the wedding ring, which was gold, and they wanted it, and he didn't want to give it. And so they did pull a gun on him in order to get the wedding ring off. But that was about the only excitement during that process. As I said, he was billeted with the English. And then here we have our Western Union. Now you look at the dates here, my poor mom is sitting from November, something or other. This is Christmas Eve, she gets this telegram, missing in action. Oh, you know, I mean not missing in action, captured, you know, and it's a prisoner of the German. It says prisoner of the war of the German government. But actually, if they're missing in action, you hope that you'll get this telegram. And this is my favorite picture of my father. I really wanted to share it with you. It was taken by a German camera as he was put into the camp. And I think you can see, I really like it. If you think of what he was going through the day before, what had happened to him as far as being shot down and all of those escapes, he's up in front of a German camp he knows nothing about. He's about to be interrogated. And to me, he doesn't look scared. And that's what I like. He's showing a little bit of attitude, and that's what the movie The Great Escape, of course, was emphasizing. Was that the what were called prisoners, or they were called Kriegies by the Germans, were well, they were pretty defiant, militaristic people. They were thinking all the time about escape and getting out and continuing to contribute to the war effort by pulling away soldiers, extra soldiers to guard them. Now, I want to say briefly that the movie The Great Escape is a pretty good guide to that phase of, this was early in Stalaag Luft III. It was supposed to be the ultimate, you can't escape from here. And they took it as a challenge. The Germans had built it. They had put microphones in so that they could detect tunneling. They had learned from all of their other mistakes. They put the barracks up on stilts so that the guards could go underneath and check for tunnels. And I'll show you the guard arrangement, how the camp was laid out. Now, there was a book by Paul Brickhill that covers this that was published, I think, in like 1960 or something like that. And so he was very, historically accurate and felt that he was telling the story of some real, American war heroes, effectively, especially the 50 that lost their lives. And so he was reluctant to have a movie made out of his book. And it turned out that John Sturgis, who was a prominent director and producer in Hollywood, wanted to make the movie and wasn't used to hearing no. And he pursued Paul Brickhill and actually became a much greater expert on the war, the air war, the camp, and everything else. And that's, but it was only when Paul Brickhill realized how knowledgeable and how sincere the director was that he sold the rights to make this movie. To introduce this book, which gives you a unique standpoint on life in the camp, which is different. Obviously, this doesn't lend itself to dramatization as much as the escape itself. But I think it's in the camp, although it sounds like my father was in a 1 in a million, hey, how did you live through it? What I read again and again when I read the recount of the experiences, and it makes sense if you think about it, everybody that was in the camp had lived through a 1 in a million crash. You know what I mean? Everybody had a story, and there were other stories as you walked around the camp that you could hardly believe about how people had either gotten out of the aircraft or how they had been captured and so forth. So Stalaag Luft III was the first incarnation of the camp, and that was the one portrayed in the movie. And here's the first few pages. Now you notice it says Sagen, Nuremberg, and Moosburg. What that refers to is that this camp was moved 2 times because of the approaching Patton's army, the approach of Patton's army. And the Germans didn't want these guys to get liberated, so they moved them. And then I'll be able to describe the conditions in the different camps and then what it was like for these guys to go on these marches, one of which was done through the snow. And so 2 separate marches were taking place as the camp was relocated. Here you go, bunk arrangement at Stalaag Luft 3D. We'll come into that one later. That's one of the later ones. But the big point on this drawing is really that to prop up the tunnel, they were pulling slats, and they were very much in need of wood, you know, to just cook on stoves and stuff like that. So these bunks started out with slats underneath and then kind of a straw deal on top that you could sleep on. But as they came by, they were pulling slats, and you know, you finally ended up with a very difficult sleeping situation. This, however, was drawn by a guy that was, he seems to have been a very literal artist. He drew exactly what was in front of him. Here's the overall layout of the camp. And all I can say is in the center you have a number of buildings. You have the food house, the fire pit, or water for fires, and the laundry. There's 17 barracks that are essentially identical. And they did a very good job in the movie of reproducing this. Oh, yeah, here you see the, you know, when you're admitted into the camp, you're given, you have to carry this card at all times. It's your ID card. And you have to show it to any guard that comes by. So that's where I stole the picture. And then you notice Nama, Voornama, Dienstgrad, and all of this. This is basically saying that my, J.R. McDonald, and then I do have a service number there that I could use to track down where he was and so forth. Also here, KGF, I think is, Dienstgrad is your rank of service, and I believe the other one is an abbreviation for Kriegi, which is sort of the start of the German word for war prisoner. They called themselves Kriegis. Oh, yeah, I was going to say a little bit about communications. My mother received 1 letter from him the whole time, and yeah, I'm fine, suffer from occasional colds. It's pretty cold. We have some ice skates. See, this was the kind of thing that you could get past the censors. We got Red Cross parcels. Boy, it tastes good. I hope you're fine. And then here's their attempt to write back to him, and it's just return to sender. So it wasn't very easy to communicate back home. West Camp, 17 barracks, cookhouse, theater, shower building, laundry, and fire pool. That's what I was trying to think of. Fire pool. It was a pool of water in case something caught on fire. September 1944. Remember, this is the first camp that the guys are in. Typical room, food stocks, blood sausage hanging from a nail. I was surprised to find this was literally just coagulated blood with a little bit of onion in it. And they said that the bread was very, very, very unappetizing. Everybody looked forward to their Red Cross parcels, and that had things like chocolate, cigarettes, and Spam. Boy, as a young man, I had so many Spam sandwiches. It was looked on as the greatest treat you could ever get, to get yourself a Spam sandwich, especially if you could put cheese on it. All right, the theater was constructed by the Russians. I won't go into this, but these guys were active. They had a wonderful theater group. They put on musicals, they put on everything, and of course everybody really looked forward. Everyone said at the first camp the problem was boredom. Of course, they were also busy digging their tunnels, weren't they? But there wasn't much to do, and so they had a lot of fun, and they occasionally could also get a movie that they could watch. This is the fire pool. Actually, they did have a boxing ring and gymnastics. And on your 4th of July, you would have who was the champion. Of course, there was no betting. Cook House, center of interest in the camp, the longest building. Here they talked about the sour taste of the bread and the soup. Every other day you could get soup, and I guess that was not very appetizing. However, what they keep emphasizing is the ingenuity, the ingenuity, the ingenuity. And I believe it. You get good cooks with nothing else to do, and you give them Spam, and you can be surprised what they come up with for a dish. So they did remarkable things, both in terms of creating stoves when they didn't have it, creating fuel when they didn't have enough. Here's the guard tower, a good rendering of the arrangement. You can see the great big spotlight. That was used at night, of course, to make sure nobody was sneaking around. It was on death to go and beyond that wooden fence. And there was a 10-foot no man's land. You could get shot. And then on the other side of that, they had a 9-foot fence with barbed wire. And it was 20 feet away from another 9-foot fence with barbed wire. And there was nothing but barbed wire in between. So again, one of their lessons from the other camps was they did not have guard towers that could be rushed, no matter how many people were trying to rush it. Oh, the Blizzard March. Okay. Well, the first relocation, we're going to get to the map, and I'll be able to show you the exact route. But what happened really was, as the Allies were getting close, they received an order. They didn't have a lot of time to prepare for it. Now we're going to be marching, and we're going to be relocating to a second camp that was considerably to the south. This first march involved some suffering because nobody died, but it would have been a tough deal. It seemed like they went about 90 miles, and they went about 9 miles a day, so it was a 10-day march, and it was across blizzard conditions when they started off. And then these guys were pulling their little sleds they had made. If you had an hour to make yourself a sled, that's about what it was. And so anyway, it was very much a question of what you could carry with you. As they exited the camp, they went past a warehouse, and a German was there to give them a Red Cross parcel, which they put on their sled. Or else you pulled out the Spam and made sure you had that. Here's the map. This is probably one of the most interesting things of the information on here. We're way up. Do you see the arrow in the upper right corner? Sagan is the extreme upper right corner up there. You can see that route all the way down to Nuremberg. So that was the first journey that was done entirely through snow. They went right past Czechoslovakia. And conditions were quite different. The war has advanced pretty far at this point. When they get to Nuremberg, by the way, they also had a railway ride for part of, they didn't walk the whole distance. But when they got into Nuremberg, the war had moved forward at this point. The Germans had lost any semblance of control of the air. In other words, the Americans were right on the edge of having complete air superiority. As they were getting ready to leave the other camp, they kind of noticed that the P-38s were coming in and not being shot at. That's a very big deal. And then they saw other reconnaissance aircraft not even getting any flak as they flew over. So they knew that things were changing very quickly in the air war. But when they got down to Nuremberg, they saw the full extent of it, because Nuremberg was under extremely heavy bombardment. And these guys were, I think, 3 miles. The camp was 3 miles from Nuremberg. But they dug trenches because during the bombing, the way it's described, okay, the first planes that came by, now remember, they had complete air superiority. And so they would run 4 big formations over Nuremberg every day. And the first formation would just lay out flares of a corridor right through the middle of the city. And so nobody could miss on their bombs. And then the whole group would just drop bombs in that corridor and completely destroy everything. It's kind of like carpet bombing. And then later in the day, another corridor, kaboom, like that. And here the city's still on fire the next day. And now the British come in and do the same exercise. And so this city was just being under constant bombardment. And 3 miles away, they have flak and shrapnel raining down, enough to hit you on the head and stuff. And so they dig trenches at this new camp. The new camp that they went to was nothing like the one in Sagen. It was filthy. They had bed bugs. It was impossible to sleep. It had been and there was no supplies in the camp. Again, you're dealing with the war situation where everything's kind of falling apart. Now you don't get your Red Cross parcels every week. And so very difficult conditions in the second camp. That was called really Stalaag Luft 13D. There's the trenches that I told you about, where they hid in there, and sometimes a guy would put a pot over his head to try to not, get hit by the shrapnel, or a shutter. And the guys were terrified, and they said that nobody was bored during the second part of this. And also, believe me, nobody was worrying about digging tunnels or that kind of thing anymore. They were under pressure. Also, the other camp had this nice big perimeter. You could walk around and stuff like this, and this was just a much yuckier situation from A to Z. They only had one central corridor in which everybody would walk up and down to get exercise. Oh, now here we have, now again, he was in the top bunk and he sketched what was right in front of him, which is kind of cool. Now this Kriegi in the foreground here is looking at a map. And there was 2 sources of information. The official German news did come through, and they had an announcer that was supposed to go from barracks to announce the German news. But the prisoners had crystal radios and were receiving BBC broadcasts, and they made their own summaries of the news. And that was copy number 2 that the guy brought around. And so when he was in the barracks reading out the news, he would read the German news, and then as long as the guard, they said there aren't any guards around, they had people lookouts, and as long as they said the coast is clear, the Germans, it was both guards and then ferrets that would hang around and listen and stuff like that. So they would make sure that they were good to go, and then they would start reading the BBC news. My father said that he took a little bit of the British standpoint and said that the Americans were so new to the camp they didn't know how to do things, and they kept losing their radios. And so the British, who had been there and had you know, the ability to get what they needed, they would always have to like stage a fight and then run up to the thing and throw a radio over for the Americans to get it, you know, make a distraction and this kind of thing. So my father experienced that from the other side. Yeah, you can't really see the crowded conditions that much in this drawing. The only thing I want, this shows kind of the ingenuity. It's an actual of one of the interiors. And you notice that the Germans did give them a stove, but you see that that stove has been put over on its side. Well, this again is the ingenuity. You have a much larger cooking surface if the stove is on its side. They were constantly using ingenuity to get things done. Now, they were relieved to receive the unexpected announcement that Patton was again close by. And this time they only had a few hours of notice before they were told the camp was going to move to a new location. And then Gamelsdorf was one of the big stops on this new one, this new trek to the third camp that they went to. And the third camp wasn't really an airman's camp anymore. There were prisoners from all over the world and prisoners from every branch being settled out in that camp. Also, it wasn't anything like the first march. Number one, it wasn't snowing. But it was, again, a 10-day march, and, you know, the line went for miles. But right now, the war is winding down, actually, and we're also going through a very pleasant part of Germany, especially because we've left that Nuremberg bombardment scenario. And, wow, I mean, they're going across a very idyllic countryside. They got to sleep in barns. And by now the war has fallen apart. They're not being watched as closely. At night, a lot of the men can just step out of line and go hide in a barn if they want to. At times they got full permission. They can go into the village and trade cigarettes for potatoes. You know, trading with the local villagers. So it was a very different aspect. In fact, people that had lost weight, I didn't mention this with my father. He must have had a difficult time because he came back, even from the second camp here, at only weighing about 90 pounds. But a lot of guys that had lost weight in the second camp recovered it once they started trading with the natives and stuff like that. A lot of guys got into really good situations, into little churches and stuff like that. The whole thing was breaking apart, and actual, you know, kind of escapes were taking place. Oh, and then this is another scene in Gamelsdorf. Again, on this part of the march, they're going into all kinds of nice village squares, you know, and there's barns and things like that that act as stopping off. I guess it was more or less a group, although a lot of people did take advantage of the opportunity to escape. And then here is just, again, a camp scene. They're a little more relaxed, aren't they? They're able to sit out in the open out here. And, you know, they've got more, it looks like they've got more food. So they were a little bit more comfortable. Chow time. And that would be it, my friends. That's the three incarnations of the Stalaag Luft III Airmen's Camp. I wonder if any of you had questions as we were going through the various slides. Did you have feedback or comments? Yeah?
Give me just 1 second. I'll come up to you and...
Oh, boy.
In your research, did you research any of the other stalags? My father ended up in Stalaag I, and he was freed by the Russians, but he'd started out in Poland.
Right. Yeah, only briefly, because, like I said, when they built Stalaag Luft III, it was based on the experience of these other stalags. So whoever that was must have been captured real early, and been in
Yes.
one of the other
Yes,
camps.
he was almost 18 months.
Right.
He was freed by the Russians on my birthday.
Yeah, and then those initial camps were just located to be as far away from England as they could be, so they put them in parts of Poland or down, you know, just to get them a little bit of distance. Yeah.
How much of this did you have to discover, and how much did your father share with you?
My father told this story 3 or 4 times with very little variation. He was not fond of talking about these experiences, and my overall impression is that the experience of being a POW was difficult for him. He didn't enjoy talking about it.
So what were the circumstances of your dad's actual liberation? Was he...
You know, he never dwelt on that either. There's these gaps as far as, you know, what caught his mind or what he talked about. And he never talked about that experience, which, you know, if I could redo it, I'd love to hear. Because they must have had people from all over the world, and then there must have been such joy at the point that they actually connected up with the Americans. Also, because of the starved conditions, it would have been very, very good to not be eating everything you wanted, but be under a doctor's supervision right at that moment, too. So I suspect maybe that's why there was no comment. Maybe he was put right into medical care. Other questions?
Yeah. Why don't you ask one of the vets?
Now, you were mentioning that your mother was receiving letters, or received a letter?
Yeah, I think the point of that was that it was difficult to communicate, and that the whole time that it happened, I think only one letter made it back to Creston Hollow, and that their attempts to write him were also